Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is a legacy school reading lesson for year six. For this lesson, all you'll need is your reading booklet, as always, from pages 43 to 49. We're going to be reading three extracts from a book called Goodnight Mr Tom. This is a really well-known book set in World War II. It's by Michelle Magorian, and I think you are going to like it. If you're interested in reading it, you can find this book in the school's library as well. Have a look at the front cover. It's included in your booklet. And think about what you see there. What I see is the outline of a man, a young boy carrying a bag or a satchel. What seems to be either a dog or a cat. I can't really tell. And then if you look in the sky, you'll see a lot of airplanes and what seems like mountains as well. It seems that there's going to be at least two characters, an old man and a young boy. And this story is actually set in the countryside during World War II. So just a little bit of background information before we get into it. During World War II, or right before Britain entered World War II, Germany had these bombing campaigns called the Blitz, or the Blitzkrieg, where they would come, it would be like an air raid with airplanes, and they'd come and they'd bomb a lot of the major cities in England. And because of that, the government decided to evacuate or to move lots of children, as many children as they could, and women with young children, or pregnant women, and elderly people, and people who are very sick, to the countryside, because the countrysides were not a target of these bombings. This story takes place during that time. One of the main characters is a young boy who was evacuated, and he was sent to live with an elder man or an older man in the countryside. Let's go ahead and actually read the background information section. It says, the fear that German bombing would cause civilian death prompted the government to evacuate children, mothers with babies, and the infirm. The infirm are those who are ill, from British towns and cities during World War II. Evacuation took place in several waves. The first wave came on the 1st of September 1939, the day when Germany invaded Poland, and 2 days before the British declaration of war. What they mean by waves is there would be like this mass evacuation or movement of these children and people who are in danger to the countryside. So there were three massive waves, right? So this is during the first one. Over the course of 3 days, 1.5 million evacuees were sent to the rural locations considered. Evacuation required thousands of volunteer helpers, including teachers, local officials, railway staff, and 17,000 members of the Women's Voluntary Service. So you had all of these volunteers and workers helping to move these people. Volunteers were also needed to host evacuees, and by hosting them, we mean letting them or welcoming them into their homes and keeping them safe for a period of time. Parents were issued a list detailing what their children should take with them. These included a gas mask, a change of underclothes, night clothes, a pair of stockings or socks, a toothbrush, a comb, a towel, soap, a face cloth, handkerchiefs, and a warm coat. So very, very, very basic things. So I'll give you an idea of what they were allowed to take with them, which was not very much. And even then, many families struggled to provide the children with these items on the list. So you can imagine that not all of these people are as well off as nowadays. A lot of these people struggled to just provide their kids with these basic necessities. The volunteers that brought children to the countryside were called the billeting officers. Some billeted children enjoyed being in the countryside, and some others endured a miserable time away from home. They really missed their families. More rounds of evacuations took place in the autumn of 1940, following the invasion of France, in the beginning of the Blitz, and again in 1944. So you guys have probably read about this period in time in your humanities lesson, or in your social studies lesson. So I'm pretty sure you guys have an idea of what World War II Europe was like. So let's go ahead and read about the book. So Goodnight Mr. Tom was first published in 1981, so it's an older book. And ever since it has been considered a modern classic. The story takes place in the early days of the war, and it's a powerful and touching story of a human relationship and the healing power of a friendship and love. The character in the book, a malnourished child from London, and malnourished means he's not fed properly, he's not the healthiest child. He was evacuated and billeted with an elderly widower, and a widower is a man whose wife has passed away. So this is an elderly man who is obviously lonely, and his name is Tom Oakley, who he calls Mr. Tom. William is very happy and with the kind old gentleman, but then his abusive and cruel mother calls him back home, and the question arises, will he ever be happy again? So there's definitely a plot twist in this book. William is unhappy at home. His mother is very cruel and abusive. And when he's evacuated to live in the countryside, he actually finds happiness with his foster father, Mr. Tom. All right, so a little bit about the author. Michelle Megorian was born in Portsmouth in 1947. As a child, her ambition was to become an actress. She acted in theater and television, and she has actually written several novels. So with that said, let's go ahead and read extract 1 from chapter 1. Oakley, Thomas Oakley. Ah, thank you, Mr. Oakley. She paused and took a deep breath. Mr. Oakley, with the declaration of war imminent... Tom waved his hand. I know all that. Get to the point. What do you want? He noticed a small boy at her side. It's him I've come about, she said. I'm on the way to the village hall with the others. What others? She stepped to one side. Behind the large iron gate, which stood at the end of the graveyard, were a small group of children. Many of them were filthy and very poorly clad. Only a handful had a blazer or coat. They all looked bewildered and exhausted. One tiny dark-haired girl in front was hanging firmly onto a new teddy bear. So let's stop here for a second and go over some of the vocabulary in these paragraphs. So she said, Oakley, Thomas Oakley. This is a volunteer woman speaking to Mr. Oakley. And then she begins by saying, with the declaration of war imminent, and she's about to give him a speech about how he must take in this boy. And he was just like, get to the point, whatever, I'll take him. So they said she also had a lot of other children with her who were filthy, so they're dirty, and very poorly clad. What we mean by clad is what they were wearing. So they weren't dressed very well. And only a handful of them had a blazer or a coat with them. So they were probably really cold, the poor things. And they all looked bewildered and exhausted. So they looked very confused and tired, probably from the long journey from the city or town to the countryside. All right, let's continue. The woman touched the boy at her side and pushed him forward. There's no need to tell me, said Mr. Tom. It's obligatory and it's the war effort. You were entitled to choose your child, I know, began the woman apologetically. Tom gave a snort. So Tom here is obviously a little bit impatient. He just wants to get it over with. But, she continued, his mother wants him to be with someone who's religious or near a church. She was quite adamant. She said she would only let him be evacuated if he was. Was what? Tom said impatiently. Near a church. Tom took a second look at the child. The boy was thin and sickly looking, pale, with limp sandy hair and dull gray eyes. His name's Willie, said the woman. Willie, who had been staring at the ground, looked up. Round his neck, hanging from a piece of string, was a cardboard label. It read William Beach. So let's stop here for a second and go over what we just read. So the woman is telling Tom, or Mr. Oakley, that he's allowed to choose whatever child he wants to stay with him. But this specific child, Willie or William, his mother was religious, and she wanted her son to stay with a religious family or somebody who at least lived nearby a church. So she's actually volunteering him to stay with Tom. And Will was actually very thin. We learned earlier that he was malnourished, and he was sickly looking, and he was pale, so there wasn't a lot of color in his face. This is also a sign of being very sad or cold or malnourished. And he had limp, sandy hair, so he didn't have these luscious curls in his hair. It was sandy. It was like a little ashy, and he had dull eyes. All right, so we'll continue. Tom was well into his 60s, a healthy, robust, stickily built man with a head of thick white hair. Although he was of average height, in Willie's eyes he was a towering giant with skin like coarse, wrinkled brown paper and a voice like thunder. He glared at Willie. "You'd best come in," he said abruptly. The woman gave a relieved smile. "Thank you so much," she said, and she backed quickly away and hurried down the tiny path towards the other children. Willie watched her go. "Come on in," repeated Tom harshly. "I ain't got all day." Nervously, Willie followed him into the dark hallway. It took a few seconds for his eyes to adjust to the brilliant sunshine he had let to the comparative darkness of the cottage. He could just make out the shapes of a few coats hanging on some wooden pegs and 2 pairs of boots standing below. Suppose you'd best know where to put your things," muttered Tom, looking up at the coat rack and down at Willie. He scratched his head. "Bit high for you." He means a bit high for you. "I best put in a low peg." All right, let's discuss the few paragraphs that we just read. So it was agreed that William would stay with Tom, and from the way that he speaks in this text, we'd assume that Tom is a bit impatient, maybe a bit grumpy, or that's what we would assume from the way he speaks here. He also speaks in a different dialect, right? He doesn't speak in proper English. For example, he says git, G-I-T, instead of get to the point. Suppose, I for you, instead of saying it was a bit high for you. Also, when if you look at the paragraph before the last, it said William entered the cottage, and it took a few seconds for his eyes to adjust from the brilliant sunlight he was in to the darkness of the cottage. So have you ever been out in the sun, and then when you walk in your house right away, it's a bit dark, and it does take a few minutes for your eyes to adjust and for you to be able to see things. So that's what he was going through. I like how the writer included that in the text. It's very relatable, and it helps paint a picture in our mind. All right, let's go ahead and look at extract 2 now. This is also from chapter 1. It's a shorter extract. "What you got in your bag then?" "I don't know," mumbled Willie. "Mom packed it. She said I weren't to look in." One of his socks slid halfway down his leg, revealing a large multicolored bruise on his skin and a swollen red sore beside. So he is obviously injured. And the fact that his sock slid down his leg, that tells us that it was probably a really old sock and he was poor. "That's a nasty old thing," Tom said, pointing to it. "What give you that?" Willie paled and pulled the sock back up quickly. "Best drink that afore it gets cold," said Tom, sensing that the subject needed to be changed. Willie looked intently at the changing shapes of the flame in the fire and slowly drank the tea. It thundered in his throat in his attempt to swallow it quietly. Tom left the room briefly, and within a few minutes returned. "I gotta go for a spell. Then I'll fix your room. See? Up there." And he pointed to the ceiling. "You ain't afraid of heights, are you?" Willie shook his head. "That's good, or you'd have to sleep under the table." He bent over the range and shoveled some fresh coke into the fire. "Here's an old scarf of mine," he muttered, and he threw a khaki object over Willie's knees. He noticed another bruise on the boy's thigh and said nothing. "Have a wander around the graveyard. Don't be scared of the dead. At least they can't drop an old bomb on your head." "No, mister," agreed Willie politely. "And close the front door behind you, else Sammy'll be eating your bacon." "Yes, mister." Let's stop here for a second. So, in the first couple of paragraphs, it's revealed to us that Willie, the boy, has a few bruises and sores on his leg. Earlier, we learned that his mother was abusive and very cruel, so we would assume that that's his mother who left those bruises on him, or that he was beaten by his mother. And Tom actually noticed it and just asked, like, where'd you get it from? He probably thought, well, this is a young boy. He was probably playing out in the street or something and got a bruise. But then when Tom covered it up right away, he sensed that maybe this is a sensitive topic, and maybe William is a bit embarrassed by it, so he changed the subject. This shows us that Tom is actually a lot more sensitive and compassionate than we were led to believe in the first passage or the first extract. He also shows a sense of humor by saying, have a wander around the graveyard. Tom lives nearby a graveyard. He said, don't be afraid of the dead. At least they can't drop a bomb on your head, which basically means, where you come from in the city, you have enemies dropping bombs on you. I wouldn't be afraid of a graveyard if that's something that I had lived through. And he also tells him to close the door or Sammy will be eating his bacon. We don't know who Sammy is because we haven't read the whole book, but I think it's safe to assume that Sammy is maybe a dog or a cat, maybe the dog or cat that we saw in the picture of the front cover. All right, let's go ahead and read the last paragraph. Willie heard him slam the front door and listened to the sound of his footsteps gradually fading. He hugged himself tightly and rocked backwards and forwards on the stool. I must be good, he whispered urgently. I must be good, and he rubbed a sore spot on his arm. He was such a bad boy. He knew that. Mom said she was kinder to him than most other mothers. She only gave him soft beatings. He shuddered. He was dreading the moment when Mr. Oakley would discover how wicked he was. He was stronger looking than Mom. So here, this is actually a very sad part of the extract, where Willie is actually convinced that he is a bad boy, that he's not very good, he's wicked. I wonder if you think that he is a bad boy or not. What it seems to me is that his mother has convinced him that he is bad, maybe to justify beating him. And he's actually saying that he needs to be good because he is afraid that Mr. Oakley might beat him. So he probably thinks that beating is a normal thing. Maybe that's what his mom has explained to him. I wonder if you think that that's the actual case, or maybe this is just signs of his abuse. All right, let's go ahead and move on to extract 3 now. Extract 3 is a huge jump from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 15. In this extract, he actually goes back and is sent back home to his mother after, I guess, the danger was over. Mom, he cried. Mom! Go away, she said sternly. You won't get no money from me. She probably thought he was a beggar. Mom, he repeated, it's me. She glanced down and was about to tell him to clear off when she recognized him. Yes, it was Willie. But he had altered so much. Altered means changed. She had been looking for a thin boy dressed in gray. Here stood an upright, well-fleshed boy in sturdy ankle boots, thick woolen socks, a green rolled top jersey, and a navy blue coat and balaclava. His hair stuck out in a shiny mass above his forehead, and his cheeks were round and pink. It was a great shock for her. So remember, in the previous extracts, when they described Willie, they said he was very thin and sickly and pale, and his hair was it was kind of sandy. Now it says he's well-fleshed, which means he has a lot more meat on his bone. He's a lot more well-fed now, or he's better fed. He's dressed better. He has new clothes. He has a coat with him. And his hair stuck up like a shiny mass above his forehead. And his cheeks were not pale anymore. They were pink. So he looks completely different. That's probably why she didn't recognize him in the beginning. Let's continue reading. I'm awfully pleased to see you, Mom. I've such a lot to tell you. And there's me pictures like. She was startled at his peculiar mixture of accents. So this tells us that William probably got used to speaking the way that Mr. Tom was speaking. She had expected him to be more subservient, but even his voice sounded louder. So she was used to the boy that was a bit afraid of her, And now he seems a lot more confident. His voice was louder, and he was, speaking with a bit more confidence in general. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm not very well, you see, and I'm a bit tired. I wasn't expecting such a change in you." Willie was puzzled. He thought that it was his mother that had changed. He had learnt new things, that was true, but he was still him. He studied her face. She was very pale, almost yellow in color, and her lips were so blue that it seemed as if every ounce of blood had been drained from her. The lines by her thin mouth curved downwards. He glanced at her body. She was wearing a long black coat, fawn stockings, and smart lace-up heeled shoes. A small shopping bag was now leaning against her leg. He touched her arm gently. "I'll carry that for you, Mom," he said, picking it up. She spun round and gave his hand a sharp slap. So this text, or this extract, probably reveals to us that his mother's attitude simply hasn't changed. She's still a bit abusive. She's still putting him down. And she doesn't seem too pleased by his positive change, right? Let's go ahead and read extract 4 now and move on to our questions. Extract 4 is also pretty short. And this is from chapter 20. I'm afraid we've brought you some rather bad news, William," she said. "It concerns your mother." He looked at her startled. "She wants me back?" "No." He smiled with relief. She paused. "William," she hesitated, "I'm afraid your mother is dead. She committed suicide." He looked blankly at her. I don't get you." "She killed herself." Will gazed at her in stunned disbelief. "Killed herself? But why?" "I don't know. I suppose she just didn't want to live anymore." How could anyone not want to live, thought William. There were so many things to live for. There were rainy nights and wind and the slap of the sea and the moon. There were books to read and pictures to paint and music. All right, let's stop here for a second. So in the beginning of this extract, there is a woman, probably a social worker, that's coming to him saying that she has bad news. And William said, "She wants me back." That means he actually didn't really want to go back, right? Because for him, that would be bad news. And the woman tells him no, that his mother is actually dead and she's killed herself. And he couldn't fathom, or he couldn't understand how somebody could kill themselves, because to him life was so great. All right, let's continue. "I'm from a children's home in Sussex," she explained. "It's an orphanage and it's right out in the country. There are lots of children there, and we usually find foster parents to take them into their homes. Young parents with children of their own, she smiled. "What the lady is saying," said the policeman, "is that he's willing to have you at the home." Will thrust his hands deep into his pocket and looked her straight in the eye. "No," he said, somewhat shakily. "I'm not willing. This is my home and I'm staying here." Remember, in this extract, he's actually back with Mr. Tom. "Now, my son," said the warden, "this ain't the way you talk. You don't have much choice in the matter. Your Mr. Oakley has not been keeping to the Laura kidnapping's a serious case." Will took a deep breath. "When you kidnap someone, you usually want a ransom. There ain't no one in the world who'd pay a ransom for me." And he glanced at Tom. "Except Mr. Tom. Perhaps, and he's the one who's supposed to have kidnapped me. Well, I reckon I weren't kidnapped. I reckon I was rescued." So in this extract, he is back with Mr. Tom, like I said, and I guess Mr. Tom is accused of kidnapping Will. And they're trying to take him to a children's home now that his mother has passed, and he is saying no, that there's no need to go. He can stay with Mr. Tom, and that Mr. Tom hasn't kidnapped him. He's only rescued him. Like I said, he's probably found a good home with Mr. Tom and is happy to stay there with him. Let's go ahead and have a look at your homework/classwork, pages 48 and 49. So we have 7 questions, and then we have an extension work question. You're going to describe Willie as he was described in the beginning of the story. I need you to refer to the text. And when I say that, I mean I need a quote from the text where Willie is described, and you need to surround this quote by quotation marks. For number 2, you're going to do the same thing, but for Mr. Tom, describe Mr. Tom, like I said, quote from the text surrounded by quotation marks. Question 3, explain why Willie was sent to live with Mr. Tom in the first place. Specifically Mr. Tom, not why he was evacuated to the countryside, but why was he sent to live with Mr. Tom? Question 4, how does Willie feel about himself in the beginning of the story? And where do you find the evidence for this? So you have to explain how he felt about himself, and then tell me what extract you found this in. Question 5, find expressions in extract 3 which prove that Willie is healthy now. So like I said, I'm looking for quotations surrounded by quotation marks. When they say find proof in the text, or how is he described in the story, or use evidence from the text, I always want to quote with quotation marks. Question 6, in extract 4, what proves that Willie and his brother had a bad relationship? This one is going to be a bit tricky, but like I said, I want quotes and quotation marks along with an explanation. Let's go ahead and look at question 7 now. How does Willie benefit from his relationship with Mr. Tom? Think about what his relationship was like with his mom, and now the household that he is in with Mr. Tom. And think about what Tom, the old man, might have benefited from having this young boy with him. And for extension work, you're going to imagine that you are one of the evacuees in the war, and you are living in the countryside with a family. You're going to write a letter to your parents about life in the countryside, what you do, how you spend your days, and describe your host family very briefly as well. Once you're finished, just upload your work to Seesaw. And if you have any questions, just let me know. Thank you.